As the weeks passed into months, they all settled down into a regular domestic lifestyle. For Max, getting into work wasn't the problem. It wasn't the problem that he thought it would be. Kurt worked in the centre of Brussels, so he was able to get a lift with him into town without taking the tram or metro. He would then catch a local bus which would take him directly to his place of work. The journey was repeated in the evening, and this arrangement worked very well. John was working freelance, so his time was his own, although he seemed to have lost interest in his work since moving in. He preferred to work from home most of the time, which gave him the chance to use his time as he wanted. The house was gradually getting back to normal. They had bought essential things for the house shortly after the break-in, putting the cost on Kurt's credit card. Finally, the insurance money came through without any questions, and as they added a few extras to the claim, the money was more than enough to buy everything they needed. John had bought a few things for himself, and Kurt had been able to update his computer system to a top-of-the-range equipment. It was a computer system that was far better than the old one that had been stolen. Although Max wasn't included in this buying spree, he did benefit from it, as he was now living permanently in the house. Wharton was growing quickly. He was now far bigger than Tosca, and although he had become a boisterous teenager, she was sure to keep him under control. He would also respond to her as a surrogate mother. At this time, they were all enjoying life and settling down into a routine which everyone was getting on with and feeling thoroughly at home. For Max, this was a golden time for him. He knew that he would have to go back to Birmingham and confess to Jane that he was finally leaving her in the house. The house itself was in his name, so he would have no problem selling it. He and Jane had never got round to getting married, so there was no divorce to worry about. It would be a simple breakup without any legal entanglements. For Max, though, it was the actual moments he would have to face and sit down with Jane and tell her that it was all over. He was leaving, and that was the end to it. He still had to go back home once a month and do his duty to her. On these visits, both of them realized that their relationship was over. Jane appeared more distant, and if she was expecting him to come back and resume his old life before, she never really showed it. She never questioned him about the simple chit-chat or his life, or she wasn't interested in his life in Belgium, and he wasn't interested in what she got up to while he was away. They were both now strangers living under the same roof. For Max, though, this was no longer home. Mosselstraw was now his home and where he felt the happiest. Even though he was in his 40s, he felt like a young man settling down and getting out into life, and he kept wondering why that this has happened to him before now. When he was younger, he could have missed wasting all those years trying to be someone he wasn't. Someone that was a creation of everything that other people had expected from him. He had always known that he was not that person. Not really, but he tolerated it because there was no alternative. Now, there was. He had a home where he wanted to be. He had a strange sort of family to go home to. He had friends he could identify with, and he had a dog that he'd always wanted, except Jane was afraid of dogs and she had a cat. For now, life was good. Once he had made that final break with Jane, then he would be on his own to live his life. The life he had always wanted. In the following weeks and months, they all settled into a domestic life. Wharton was growing quickly and was soon much larger than Tosca. This didn't seem to worry her much as she continued to mother this big, growing dog. Although he was becoming active and would often charge around the garden at breakneck speed, Tosca would make her feelings known if she didn't agree with his behaviour. Although he was younger and bigger than her, it was surprising how much he respected her and would calm down immediately at Tosca's bark. For the other three, they were enjoying this rather unusual kind of life. Max still went to Birmingham, but this was only for one weekend per month. I was back at work early on a Monday morning. He still hadn't done anything about his situation back home and was finding himself avoiding the situation when he was there. It was becoming obvious to him that it was only a matter of time, and Jane's growing distance meant that she also realized that the end of the relationship was coming. Perhaps she would make the first move, but she never said anything. In Mosselstraat, their way of living was attracting a number of friends and friends of friends to come and visit them. Karen was a frequent visitor, and she had grown attached to Wotan. She had an effect on him, and a sit command from her would quickly bring him to a halt, and he would then sit to order, looking at her but with respect. This was a trick that Max had not mastered, and he had absolutely no control of the dog, who would regularly ignore Max's sit command and would simply stand where he was, looking up at him and bemused. He also had the trick of taking things from the table. Nothing could be left around the house without Wotan deciding that it was his, and when he would quickly pick it up in his mouth. At one time, Max had left his sunglasses on a low table in the lounge, only to find that Wotan had grabbed them and was now standing proudly in the middle of the garden with them in his mouth. Whatever Max tried to do, Wotan would not let him close. He would run at breakneck speed around the garden with the glasses firmly lodged in his mouth. He would then stop, tempting Max to come running after him. Every time Max reached out for the glasses, Wotan would be off again, running again, round and round and round the garden. Finally, Max got tired of the game and walked back into the house, accepting that his sunglasses were gone. Wotan came into the kitchen where Max was standing and, without any hesitation, dropped them on the kitchen floor and stood there looking at him. Max couldn't do anything but pick them up, covered in whatever with teeth marks in them, and all he could do was laugh. The sunglasses were ruined, but he couldn't do anything but love this dog. They were truly becoming friends now, close friends. In the second year that they'd been living in the house, it was, for once, a very warm and humid summer. Weekends were busy for the three of them as people came to the house to avoid the city heat. It was not unusual for 2 or 3 cars being parked in the driveway for the weekend, as people made an excuse to visit on a Saturday morning and then not leave until Sunday evening. With its large open windows and spacious garden, the house was relatively cool compared to living in an apartment in the centre of Brussels. People always brought gifts and supplies so that their fridge was always full with a selection of food, beer, and wine. That summer, they enjoyed themselves in a way that Max had never experienced. There were people from different countries and different backgrounds. There were conversations in Dutch, French, and German around the garden table, which seemed to be constantly in use. Some of these discussions were lost on Max, as his command of other language was, at best, limited. However, as soon as he was involved, people resorted to English, so that he could understand the conversations and join in. He felt slightly embarrassed that he couldn't change from one language to another as easily as other people did. Even John spoke fluent French. Everyone appeared to speak English fluently as a second language, and occasionally someone would remark to him that they were glad they could talk to a British person as a native English speaker, because it gave them the chance to practice the language. It was something people in Belgium really got the chance to do, and as they were required to speak either French or Dutch at work. So speaking English was a skill a lot of people were eager to learn. For Max, looking back, he realized that this had been a special time in his life. He was changing, and his attitudes were also changing. He was beginning to understand how closed his life had been up to this point. He was now finding that there were a wider variety of people and lifestyles in Europe than he had ever expected. It was not that he had been ignorant or ill informed, but he was finding out that he needed to be open minded about how other people lived. It was never something he had expected when he had first accepted the job offer so many months ago. To Max, it seemed like a lifetime ago, and he couldn't believe how much he had moved on since those days. He and John still travelled into the city centre for a beer occasionally. Sometimes Kurt would join them, but this was a rare occasion. Max had discovered that he really was a home-loving man, and although the offer was always there, Kurt preferred to stay at home with the dogs and his computer games. He almost welcomed the opportunity to spend some time on his own, so he didn't mind at all when John announced that he and Max were going to spend the evening in the city centre. For John and Max, this was a chance to reconnect with people that they knew in the city. More often than not, they ended up in one of the gay bars. It was a lifestyle that Max was getting used to, and then was beginning to wonder if he too was gay, as he found that he was making more and more friends from the community. There was no pressure. There was no requirement for him to be gay. People in Brussels simply accepted him as he was. Perhaps they thought that he and John were a couple, but for them, that wasn't ever going to happen. John loved Kurt, and regardless of his boasts about sexual encounters, he was essentially faithful to Kurt. He would often flirt, but it was never anything more than fun. Max and he were simply friends, brought together by a common friendship. That was all it was. And it was all that it ever would be. Those evenings were fun, and they found that they could talk between themselves for hours on end. There was never a dull moment, and there was never any quiet period, especially with John. When he became bored, there was always someone else to talk to. John loved to talk. He liked the attention. He was a good-looking man with his blonde hair and blue eyes. He had even been a male model years ago when he was a lot younger. So in a gay bar, he often attracted attention from the other customers. People would also come and talk to Max, while he could only speak English. Once again, this didn't appear to be any real problem. Occasionally he would find a man attractive, but that was only natural. There was nothing wrong in one man finding another man good-looking. Didn't make him gay. However, Max was still questioning his own sexuality and wondered if his confusion was only because of his background. Perhaps he could be gay. But for the time being, he wasn't interested in having a relationship with another man, and certainly not sex. Sometimes when he was talking to an attractive man, his mind would wander and he would try to imagine having sex. But that was all it was. It was just curiosity. He was happy being single and being with John, and the thought of starting any kind of relationship with someone else just didn't enter his mind. After all, he still had Jane back in Birmingham, and that was going to be a problem in itself. A problem that he was going to have to deal with for once and for all. Perhaps after he had cleared up this obstruction in his life and he had fully accepted that he had left Britain behind, he could settle down and find someone else for himself. If that ever happened, then he would take his time over it. He wasn't ready to dive into any relationship that didn't suit him and his new life. He was enjoying himself too much. He didn't want a relationship to interrupt that. If he found someone, then they would have to accept who he was, the real him. not expect him to change to fit in with their expectations. Love me, love my dog, also my friends, and my house, and my lifestyle, and my attitudes, and me, my everything. If he was going to have a relationship with someone, it was going to have to be on his terms, or not at all. Perhaps that was selfish, but at his age he felt that he'd earned the right to be selfish for once. All his life he had felt that he was only doing what other people wanted. Now he was doing things for himself, and only himself.